That's the ultimate chok. That's the mitzvah paraduma of the red cow, of how the ashes, the red cow was burned, was slaughtered and burned, and some of the ashes of the red cow would be taken together with living waters, and they would be sprinkled. They would be sprinkled on someone who became contaminated because they came in contact with someone who died. Now, and that is the ultimate chok. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, said that he was able to understand everything, but the mitzvah, the law paraduma, he wasn't able to understand. Nevertheless, and I've mentioned this before, nevertheless, many of the Mefarshim, many of the commentaries, they explain they offer explanations for paraduma. Most famous is Rabbi Moshe Darshan, quoted by Rashi. Rabbi Moshe Darshan says that the reason for paraduma, in other words, the paraduma is a kapara, an atonement for the golden calf. The paraduma represents the adult cow, and the adult cow, a parent cleans up, a mother cleans up the mess that its child made. And figuratively, the golden calf, that's the child, according to this explanation of the paraduma. Now, of course, we have to understand what the connection, even according to Moshe Darshan, we have to understand the connection between paraduma and being in contact with someone who died. But that's not the main focus of the shir of the shir today. But so the question is, on one hand, paraduma is identified as the ultimate chok, the law that is most difficult to understand, that we are not, that is beyond human comprehension. On the other hand, Moshe Darshan is explaining the reason for paraduma. And my uncle suggests something, and I've mentioned this before, and a number of the things that I'm going to say today, certainly at the beginning of this year, were mentioned before, but I plan to go on a different path toward the end of this year. So my uncle said there are three types of explanations. There's an explanation of why, and that is beyond human comprehension. Why HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded this mitzvah as well as the many of the other mitzvahs of the Torah. And then there is how. How does the paraduma take away the contamination that a person has been affected with as a result of coming in contact or being in a room with a dead body? But then there's a third explanation, that's the what. And the third explanation of the what is the lesson. The lesson that I deduce from paraduma. And my uncle suggested that all the reasons given, let's say by Rav Moshe Darshan and by the others to explain paraduma, those are not explanations of why and how, but they're explanations of what. What is the lesson that can be derived from it? And the truth is, the lesson that can be derived from it could change from one generation to another. It might have more meaning to Jews of one generation and less meaning to another Jews of another generation. And of course, the Jews of that other generation, they might have the Jews a different lesson to Paraduma. The message that they hear in Paraduma could be different than the message that the earlier generation heard. And even more than that is that Paraduma might have a different message for different people, even within the same generation. So, to a large extent, when I talk about Paraduma, and when I talk about Tamei HaMitzvos, I'm talking about the reasons for the mitzvah, that the message that I hear in Paraduma. I am not claiming that somebody else hears a different message. On the contrary, it could be all the messages are true. Now, it's interesting, but in general, I think it's important to understand the whole concept of Tamei HaMitzvos. Many of the Mefarshim give reasons for the mitzvahs, and for the most part, these reasons are to be understood from the perspective of the message, of what the message of the mitzvahs are. Now, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, very strange Rambam. The Torah tells us, ayin tachas ayin, if somebody puts out somebody's eye or destroys a limb of another person, so the Torah says, ayin tachas ayin. And the simple translation of the words of ayin tachas ayin is that his eye is put out in place of the eye of the person who he injured. And of course, our sages tell us that we're not to take that pasuk literally. We have to understand it. Ayin tachas ayin is to be viewed from the perspective of mammon. You have to pay, and there are all kinds of ways of evaluating the monetary value. Of course, no one wants their eye put out, regardless of the amount of money they're going to make. But there is a certain schedule, if I could use that, of evaluating what is to be paid for what damages that were done. So the Rambam says, what is the reason for ayin tachas ayin? The Rambam says, because a person who put out somebody's eye, he deserves to have his eye put out. And then the Rambam says the most remarkable thing, very strange. The Rambam says, I know that you might ask a question, that our sages say that ayin tachas ayin doesn't mean that literally the eye of the aggressor is put out. It only means mamo. He says the tachlis, the purpose of this work, meaning the Moreh Nevuchim. And the Rambam indicates a similar idea, not as explicit in the Yad Chazaka. The purpose is to explain the Torah in accordance with its pashut pshat, with the simple explanation. Nevertheless, we know that the Rambam in Yad Chazaka says that throughout the generations, dating back to the Bezdin of Shmuel Hanavi, They knew that it was a halacha Moshe Sinai. There was a tradition from Sinai that when the Torah says ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, the Torah doesn't mean literally that a person's eye is put out, but the Torah means to say that it's only from the perspective of money, So what's the explanation? The explanation is the Torah is telling us what he really deserved. That person that was so callous, and he put out somebody's eye. He deserves to have his eye out. It's true, there was a halacha Moshe Sinai. There was a law given to Moshe at Sinai and passed through all the Batei Dinim, all the courts of all the generations, that we give, that it's not to be taken literally, that it's money. He has to pay the value of the eye. But the Torah wanted us to know that the person deserved, maybe the Torah wanted him to know, that he deserved to have his eye put out. And the money that we give, that's in place of the halacha, in place of what he deserved. Now, so the question is, how does this fit with the concept of Tameh mitzvos, reasons for the mitzvos? But we see that the Rambam's opinion is that when it comes to Tameh mitzvos, when it goes to the reasons or the message of the mitzvos, the message does not play a role in why I do the mitzvah. I do the mitzvah because I was commanded by God. There's a story that my grandfather was a Rav in Chaslavich. And Chaslavich was a Lubavitcher town. And the Baal Tokeya, before he started blowing shofar, it was Rosh Hashanah, and he started crying. Some attribute the reason why this Lubavitcher, who apparently was a Lamdan, this Lubavitcher Baal Tokeya, was crying. Apparently he was crying very hard. It wasn't the fake cry that people today do. The European Jews were very extremely sincere. They didn't try to put up a show. Rosh Hashanah meant something special to them. Yom Kippurim meant something special to them. They knew that their lives were at stake. And more than that, they knew that they're standing in judgment in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so he was crying. And my grandfather was concerned that lest his crying would interfere with the blowing of the shofar. And that would affect the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. That everybody, that the fulfillment of the mitzvah of all the members of the congregation, all the members of the kohal. And because of that, my grandfather said to him, I forgot what his name was, let's say it was Rabbi Avram, I don't know, why are you crying? So according to the way some say, that he answered my grandfather, because in the Hasidus of Chabad, the sound of the shofar is the sound of the neshama wanting to join its source. And my grandfather said to him, tell me, do you cry before you eat matzah? And he said, no, on the contrary, before I eat matzah, I'm in a very happy mood. My grandfather said, in that case, you should be in a happy mood before you blow shofar also, because shofar is a mitzvah just like matzah. And the truth of the matter is that what my grandfather said is very similar to something that the Rashba says. The Rashba discusses on which mitzvahs we make shechiyanu and which mitzvahs we don't make shechiyanu. And he says, on Rosh Hashanah and Shofar, we make shechiyanu. Why? Because we know that as a result of the shofar, we feel somewhat assured that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to give us atonement. So that's why we make shechiyanu on the mitzvah of shofar. So the Baal Tokeya, when he heard what my uncle said, my grandfather said, so he said to my grandfather, he says, but the Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva says, Remez yesh b'davar. There is a hint, a message in the shofar. And what is the message of the shofar? The message of the shofar is Ur Yesheni Mitir Maschem. You who are sleeping in a spiritual lethargy, awake from your lethargy. So there is a message in the shofar, a startling message, almost a frightening message. Why shouldn't I cry? And my grandfather's response to him was, it's this, the remez yesh b'davar, the message of shofar. The Rambam doesn't mention it in Hilchos Shofar, in the laws of shofar. He mentions it in Hilchos Tshuva. In other words, the message of shofar is not part of the mitzvah of shofar. To a certain degree, we could suggest that according to the Rambam, it's part of the mitzvah of tshuva. In other words, a person has to study, part of the mitzvah of tshuva is to study the laws concerning Rosh Hashanah and Yom HaKippurim, and to get inspiration for them to do tshuva. But the mitzvah of shofar itself, is a mitzvah of just fulfilling the command of God, submitting. Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav mitzivanu lishmoa kol shofar. That was the answer that my grandfather gave. What did my grandfather mean? In other words, what my grandfather meant to say is that yes, there are tamei hamitzvos, and we focus on the message of the mitzvah. But focusing on the message of the mitzvah is not part of the mitzvah. It's done for extraneous reasons, to have an impact on our personality, to inspire us, to give us direction. But it's not part of the mitzvah itself. And I think what he's saying is, but ayin tachasayin, the message of ayin tachasayin is not part of the halacha of ayin tachasayin. But when I study about ayin tachasayin, there is a message contained there for me. And the message of ayin tachasayin is that I should think when I have to deal with someone, think in terms of myself. Be as sensitive to the other person or to the possible damage that you're going to cause the other person as you be sensitive to the damage that would be happening to you. That's why a person who puts someone's eye out deserves to have his own eye out. So since it's not a halacha in the ayin tachasayin itself, perhaps it's a halacha in harchachas nezikin in general. A person has to be on guard against doing damage to others and to the property of others. So we studying about it, studying about the significance of being careful. Perhaps that's part of the mitzvah as well. And I think, so that's the idea of the Rambam. The Rambam, so when you read the Torah Shebachsav, even though the Torah Shebal Peh offers a different way of understanding the way we do the mitzvah, but the fact that the Torah Shebachsav, the written tradition, formulated the mitzvah in a certain way, there is something to learn from the way the mitzvah was formulated in the Torah. And I think that's the approach of the Rambam when it comes to Tamei Mitzvos, to giving reasons for the mitzvahs. And so, but this led to another question regarding Tamei Mitzvos that's been bothering me. Most of the reasons, we have all kinds of Tamei Mitzvos, and it varies from one commentator to the other. In other words, if you look at the Chinuch, when he gives reasons for the mitzvos, so the Chinuch will emphasize how the mitzvahs help mold our character traits. In fact, seems to have been a dispute in general between the Rishonim and the Achronim. For most of the Rishonim, it appears that the mitzvahs have an impact on our personality in molding our character traits. Whereas in the Achronim, it seems the reverse, and this really was the foundation of the Muslim movement. The idea was, in order to observe the mitzvos, you have to mold your character traits. In other words, you could not successfully observe the mitzvos unless you mold your personality traits, your character traits. Okay, there seems to be a dispute from the Gra, from the Vilna Gaon. It appears that the Vilna Gaon, and to a certain degree, the Vilna Gaon really is the foundation of the Muslim movement, even though he himself was not part of the Muslim movement. But he saw Tikkun Hamidos, working on character traits, as something that was necessary for the proper fulfillment of the mitzvahs. Whereas if you look at the Chinuch and the Rambam to a certain degree, they see the observance of the mitzvahs, or the study of the mitzvahs in the Rambam's case, as something that helps mold the character traits. It could be both are true. But those are the two different approaches that are emphasized among the commentaries. Now, but according to the Rambam, when you look at the Rambam, Moreh Nevuchim, when he gives the reason for most of the mitzvos, it seems to be of historical nature rather than molding the character traits. There are those that have to do with molding of the character traits, but there are those that the Tamei HaMitzvos that don't have to do with the molding of character traits. And for example, the mitzvah of karbanos, of giving sacrifices. When the Rambam explains the mitzvah of giving sacrifices, he explains it because historically the Jewish people were so involved in idolatry. In other words, he says, ideally, this should not have been, according to the Rambam, if you take the Rambam very literally, a mitzvah of karbanos, of sacrifices. He says the sacrifices is a lower level of service to God. A higher level of service to God is davening, is prayer. He says, but because the Jewish people became so involved in idolatry, they in order to wean them away from idolatry, the Torah created a mitzvah of karbanos, of giving sacrifices. And had the Torah not provided for karbanos, for the mitzvah of karbanos, so then people would have had trouble leaving idolatry. And of course, that presents a challenge to the Jews of this generation, where idolatry is not so prevalent. And many answers are given to that question. Maybe when we get to Parshas Vayikra, we will discuss it. But how does this fit in? How does this fit in with this concept of Tamei HaMitzvos? If it would be a question of character traits, we understand. We study the mitzvos in order to understand. We study the mitzvos in order that it should have an impact on our character. But why is it? Or let's say the din of Orla, according to the Rambam, Orla is and that to Rabbi, that was based as a negation of idolatrous practices. So how does that fit in with this explanation? But I think part of it is we have to understand the impact that idolatrous practices have upon us. So much so that the Torah had to create ways to wean the Jew away from avodah zarah, from idolatry, because they came so used to these practices. There is an attitude today of trying to imitate the religious practices of other nations and to bring them into Judaism. The Torah brought karbanos in, according to Rambam, because it was absolutely necessary. Not because it should have been that way, according to the Rambam. But today, people are trying to take approaches used in Buddhism and trying to make that part of the Jewish practices. That's the opposite of what the Torah was. The Torah the Torah tries to negate these practices. So I think the Tamei HaMitzvos, according to the Rambam, where it has to do with the Jewish people having been used to idolatrous practices, was to tell us how severe the idolatrous practices had upon the Jewish people, that the Torah had to mold mitzvos in order to wean the Jew away from idolatry. Okay, but so in any case, those are the messages of the mitzvahs. So what is the message of the mitzvah of Tumah and Tahara, of Tumas Mes, of contamination, of coming into a room where there's a dead body, or coming in contact with a dead body, and then needing to be sprinkled with the Ephah Parah, with the ash of the red cow, combined with the living waters, and then to go to the mikveh and to rise above the water of the mikveh. How are we to understand it? So in the past, I explained it, that there are two approaches to life. One approach to life is to see life as a process of living, and the other is to see life as a process of dying. Yaakov, when he heard that Yosef was dead, Taraf Yosef, that Yosef was ripped apart by an animal. When he saw the clothes of Yosef stained with blood, and his children got up to console him. So the Torah says, Vayimayin, he refused to accept it. He says, Anochi ered livni shola, I will go down to the grave to my son. Life became for him a process of dying. There was no room for consolation. He couldn't be consoled. But then when he heard, oh, Yosef Chai, that Yosef is alive, he was able to reverse the process. But the Ruach Yaakov Avihem, the spirit of Yaakov became alive again. And there are two approaches to confrontation with death, two approaches to depression. One approach to depression is the Yaakov approach. But there's another approach. And I would say that's the Esav approach. Esav comes in tired from the field, and he hears that Avram Avinu passed away. And he says to Yaakov, Yaakov was making some kind of red beans. And he told him, pour it in my mouth, indulgence. That's another. Life has no special meaning. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Indulgence. And the same thing was true. What caused the Jewish people to worship the golden calf? What caused the Jewish people to worship the golden calf is because the Satan made it appear to them as if Moshe Rabbeinu was dead. And what did they do? They gave sacrifices to the idolatry. But all that was just to give religious fervor to indulgence. What did they do afterwards? Vayochlu, vayishtu, vayikumu letzachek. They ate, they drank, and they got up to be merry, indulgence. And what is the mitzvah paraduma? So when one confronts death, you confront death in one of two ways, either by indulgence or on the contrary, just get away from it all. Total depression. So what's the mitzvah paraduma? The mitzvah paraduma is we take the ashes of the cow. In a sense, I would say it a little different than Moshe Hadarshan. The ashes of the cow represents the adult Egel. The Egel Hazav was in the early years of the year of the Jewish people from Egypt. But many years have passed. And to a certain degree, we still confront the same problems. We take the red. Red is the symbol of sin. Im yechatechem kashani. Kashali galbino, I'll make it white. If your sins will be like scarlet red, it can become white, like snow. But we have to understand the lesson. So we take the ashes of the paraduma, of the red cow, and we take it which symbolizes destruction. The ultimate destruction is ashes, with living waters, which represents life, because out of death can emerge life. And even though we go through a state of death, and that is sprinkled upon the person who came in contact with the dead. And when a person goes into the mikveh, he lowers his head in the water of the mikveh. He goes into a medium where man can't survive. And many of the Farshim say, when is the Tahara accomplished? Not while he's completely underneath the water, but as he emerges from the water. He goes from a state of non-existence into a state of existence. To impress upon the person that they can accomplish what Yaakov did. But the Chiruach Yaakov Avihem, the spirit of Yaakov became alive. And that's how I explained. That's how I explained the message of Paraduma. However, it's interesting when you take a look at the Rambam. The Rambam in Yarach HaZachah, when he explains Tum and Tahara, he wasn't talking just about a dead body and all that. When the Rambam explains the mitzvah of Tumah, he says Tumah is not really something physical. Yeah, you can touch something physical. You can be in a room with a dead body. But there's nothing physical between you and the dead body. And the same is true about the other forms of Tumah. And certainly the process of Tahara, of going to the mikveh, that doesn't really physically remove anything. So the Rambam says the lesson behind Tumah and Tahara is that we think of sins in terms of actions that we take, of things that we did, of foods that we might have eaten. But the Rambam says It's not that. It's not just that. Character traits, thoughts, ideas. They really don't have real existence. But that's also tummy. But you say it doesn't exist. Thoughts don't exist. Ideas don't exist. It's all in the mind. But it affects who you are. And that's the idea. That's part of the lesson. That's the message, not the reason for. But to a certain degree, that's the message of Tum and Tahara. That even something is not an action. You don't do something. Something that's just in the mind. A fleeting thought. That's also of significance. And to a certain degree, you need tahara for that. You need a form of tshuva for that as well. And the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, in the laws of tshuva, that one has to return to God even where he did not have the proper midos, the proper character traits. It goes without saying, if somebody loses his temper, if someone indulges, but it's more than that. A person not only has to be on guard, not to succumb to the urges that he has, even if it's not urges that involve Chol Shabbos, these type of mitzvos, even if it's urges that are improper, that are demonstration of improper character traits. But a person shouldn't even have a mental tendency to do these things. In other words, you have to mold your mind in such a way that you shouldn't feel a compulsion. Even your thoughts count. And it's very interesting, Rosh Hashanah, which is we have to understand why, according to the Rambam, was the laws of Tumah and Tahara, of contamination and purification used to teach us about the significance of thoughts and the attitudes, even though they don't manifest themselves in actions. Why is it that way? But what is the law of Tum and Tahara? What is the impact of being Tameh? What is the effect of becoming contaminated? The effect is that you can't go to the Beis HaMikdash, to certain areas. You can't touch certain holy things. In other words, Tumah and Tahara plays a role to a certain degree that separates you from coming closer to God on a certain level. And that's what we have to know. When we think of what we have done, we think of our status in terms of coming closer to God. We can't just look at the deeds we did. We have to look at who we are. And who we are is not limited to the way we appear. maybe, when it comes to davening, there's a halacha, hikon l'krasa l'kecha Yisrael. You got to prepare yourself. You dress properly. Some of the commentaries say that when you dress for davening, you should dress in a manner like you're going in to see royalty, to see the leader of your country. That has to do with the way you look. But when you're standing before God, God doesn't just see the clothes that you're wearing. God sees much more than that. God sees what you're thinking, what your attitudes are. God sees more than you see in the mirror. And in a sense, it's what God sees that sometimes can create a separation between you and him. And the truth of the matter is, it's not just what God sees. It's what we realize about ourselves that can cause a separation between us and God. But sometimes if it's not a maisa, there's no action involved. So we can go into an attitude of self-denial. Deny that we have these problems that would separate us from God. So the halacha of Tum and Tahara comes and says, even though there's nothing physical, you are separated from God. You don't need something physical to separate you from God. That's why we can learn from that. That's why we can learn from that a person has to be careful, not just about what he does, but what he thinks and what his attitudes are, even though they don't manifest itself in something that is revealed. Because ultimately these things are certainly revealed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and even to us, before we go into denial, they're revealed to us as well. And it's very interesting that when a Mitzorah had to take two birds, according to some, the two birds had to look alike. And one bird was killed, and the other bird was dipped in the blood of the first bird and was set free. And figuratively, that bird, that's us. The Mitzorah is the one who spoke Lashon Hara. And birds chirp. And very often we say things that we shouldn't say because we have this need to talk. We somehow believe that we're not the center of attention. If our voice is not heard, so we don't have real existence. The Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva, when he talks about Tshuva, he says a person has to say, Ani Eini Osa Ish. I'm not that same person. Tshuva is not just getting away, deciding I'm going to refrain from the action that I did. But Tshuva is remaking who you are. It's a process of recreation. The first day of the Aseres Yemei Tshuva is Rosh Hashanah. What does Rosh Hashanah commemorate? Rosh Hashanah commemorates the The Rosh Hashanah commemorates the creation of man. And on the anniversary of the creation of man, we have to recreate ourselves. I think the Medrash Rabbi in beginning of Chukas suggests that in Chukas osam, that I will consider it like you made yourself. How does one change his personality? More than that, how does one form his personality? The Ramban says the mitzvah of Doshim Tiyo is novel b'rishus Torah. Not to be novel b'rishus Torah. In other words, we have mitzvahs like kashrus. We have mitzvahs like nazir that tell us about limitations in certain situations, what we can take and what we can eat. Can't eat everything. There are things that are prohibited from eating. And we could follow the letter of the law. But we're required to, in a sense, follow the spirit of the law as well. We have to let the mitzvos of the Torah affect our personality. That is part of the message of the mitzvahs. It's not the total reason for the mitzvahs, but it's part of the message. Part of the message of Nazir is to learn about not becoming an alcoholic. The laws of kashrus, part of the message of kashrus is to learn limitations, not in just what we eat, but in how much we eat. And all the mitzvah Torah, Doshim Tiyu, is according to the Ramban, not just do the mitzvos, but let the mitzvos have an impact on your personality. You know, there are those that they work on their character traits. I think the simple reading, certainly that's the opinion of the Rishonim. The Torah, we have to let the Torah serve as a guide about how our personality traits should be formulated, and especially when we do tshuva. The tshuva has to manifest itself in recreating ourselves. In the words of the Rambam, as I mentioned, to say, Ani Eini Osish, I'm not that same person. The two birds of the Metzorah, they looked exactly alike, but one was killed and the other was dipped in the blood of the first one and set free. When I do tshuva, I look exactly alike the sinner. But Ani Eini Osish, I'm set free if I really do tshuva. I really recreate myself. I might look like the person who sinned, but I am a different person. And that's the message of Tumah and Tahara. The message of Tumah and Tahara is it's not enough to change your deeds. That's certainly a requirement. But you have to change who you are. And changing who you are is not just changing what you do, but changing what you think and changing your attitudes. And the way to do that is by dedication to Torah, by the observance of the mitzvos, and by letting the mitzvos affect our personalities. Okay. All right, I assume, I guess I won't be able to answer any questions. Okay. Okay. Next week, the share will be at the same time, and everything should go well with everybody. Okay. Thank you.